So-called germ theory has become a major threat to humanity, and as we have witnessed in our lifetimes, it is not because of the germs. For reasons we have documented in our publications, it is easier to blame sickness on purported viruses. Most people are unaware that the virologists themselves cannot show the existence of their imagined entities. However, some diseases are said to be caused by bacteria, microbes that do exist. One of these diseases is diphtheria, once a feared and deadly condition, but now extremely rare in developed countries. The medico-pharmaceutical establishment would like us to believe this situation exists as a result of their products. However, the story doesn't add up, and the evidence I'm about to show you reveals a 19th century misconception that now manifests as a 21st century lie. Before we analyse the history of diphtheria, we need to consider whether it is actually a specific disease. Allopathic medicine makes the claim that there are tens of thousands of specific diseases, but such a claim is highly dubious. Additionally, some diseases are said to be hundreds or even thousands of years old, and yet diagnostic tests have only been available in recent decades. This makes historical analyses of alleged case numbers very difficult, and you could watch my video, Exploding the Spanish Flu Myth, for an example of this issue. Symptoms and signs such as sore throat, cough, and fever are non-specific, and the disease classification can end up being a subjective choice by a doctor or entirely dependent on which tests are selected. For my husband, Mark, and I, we abandoned many of these alleged specific disease classifications and instead address the much more limited number of responses the body can manifest. However, even if we take diphtheria as a specific disease, the establishment's own data entirely refutes itself anyway. The name diphtheria first appeared in English in 1857 after the French physician Pierre Bretonneau coined the term diphtheriae in 1855. The word derived from the Greek diphthera, which meant prepared hide or leather, and referred to the tough membrane that forms in the throat of severe cases. According to the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the disease was first described by Hippocrates in the 5th century BC. The CDC's current definition for a confirmed case is a clinically compatible case that is either laboratory confirmed or epidemiologically linked to a laboratory confirmed case. I won't get into the lab test details here, but essentially they relate to the detection of the alleged pathogenic bacterium, Corynebacterium diphtheriae. The CDC states that the clinical criteria for diphtheria are upper respiratory tract illness with sore throat, low-grade fever, and an adherent, dense, grey pseudomembrane covering the posterior aspect of the pharynx. In severe cases, it can extend to cover the entire tracheobronchial tree. The first two criteria are, of course, incredibly non-specific and would encompass any flu-like illness. The third criterion is more unique, and in medical school this is presented to students as the classic textbook example. However, this is where the case definition derails, because according to official sources, this finding is really seen. In fact, we were informed by the World Health Organization in 2006 that, quote, most infections with C. diphtheriae are asymptomatic or run a relatively mild clinical course. The first point to note is the asymptomatic infection card made famous during the COVID era. It is an example of the perversion of language by so-called medical science. We have covered this problem in many of our publications and observed how it is used to influence both the public and those in the industry. For example, with regard to infection, here is a flashback to my video, The Truth About Contagion. The word infection entered the English language in the 14th century and derives from the Latin inficere, which means to spoil or to stain. The wider meaning of infect was also to fill with disease, render pestilential, pollute, contaminate, and to corrupt morally. You will note there is no mention of contagious germs here, because this is half a millennium before the introduction of germ theory. It is also interesting to see that the use of the word infection took off after 1880. the decade when the germ theorists were starting to be promoted. You can watch more of that video to appreciate how the meanings of several related words were also modified to advance the germ theory. And speaking of germ theory, the second point to consider in the WHO's statement that C. diphtheriae infections are often asymptomatic is the violation of Koch's first postulate. This postulate states that the microorganism must be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease, but should not be found in healthy organisms. In order to make this work, suffering from the disease can now mean the person has no symptoms, in which case healthy means, well, I guess they need a new definition for that as well. Some of our critics protest that Koch's postulates are not relevant and are merely of historical interest due to caveats that were subsequently added or technological developments that rendered the framework obsolete. We need to keep reminding these critics that Koch's postulates were logical and consistent with the scientific method. The criteria allowed the germ hypothesis to be tested and falsified, and that's what happened to Robert Koch himself. We discovered this when we reviewed his original work, including the 1882 paper, The Etiology of Tuberculosis. As we have discussed in presentations such as TB, cows, lies, and cock-ups, Koch neither fulfilled his postulates nor demonstrated that mycobacteria instigated disease in animals or humans. Here, I would also recommend Mike Stone's analysis of Koch's work, including the excellent essay, TB or Not TB. Diphtheria is said to be caused by the bacterium Corynebacterium diphtheriae, first identified by microbiologist Edwin Klebs in 1883. A decade prior to Robert Koch's postulates, Klebs had outlined 4 Grundversuche, or fundamental tests to identify pathogenic bacteria. They can be summarized as follows. First, all bacteria are pathological. Second, bacteria never occur spontaneously. Third, every disease is caused only by bacteria. Fourth, the bacteria that cause distinguishable disease are distinguishable. Although it was subsequently admitted that this outline was false, it illustrates both Klebs' conviction that bacteria were dangerous and provided influence on other germ proponents, such as Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur. While it is said that Klebs first identified C. diphtheriae as the cause of diphtheria in 1883, he in fact only described the bacterium that year. Hence, it is also known as the Klebs-Loeffler bacillus because of the claim that Frederick Loeffler demonstrated the causative role in disease the following year. To find out if this is true, we need to consult Loeffler's 1884 publication, which translates to Investigations into the Importance of Microorganisms for the Development of Diphtheria in Humans, in Pigeons and Calves. If you want to see this in English, download it into a PDF from the link provided and then upload the document into a program such as Google Translate. The paper is very long, and near the beginning, Loeffler lists his criteria for establishing that a microbe is disease-causing. 1. Organisms must be consistently detected in the locally diseased areas in a typical arrangement. 2. The organisms which, according to their behaviour towards the diseased parts, are thought to be important for the occurrence of these changes, must be isolated and cultivated in pure form. 3. The disease must be able to be experimentally recreated using pure cultures. He then outlines investigations that had been done with suspected C. diphtheriae up to that time. Often these researchers identified bacteria amongst inflamed mucosal tissue. In other words, they observed an association. In some experiments, diseased tissue was injected directly into the eyes of pigeons and the veins or abdomens of dogs. Their deaths were blamed on the imagined infectious agent, although it was admitted that their disease did not resemble clinical diphtheria. In one highly unnatural experiment, heart muscle tissue from a deceased 2-year-old child was sewn into the tracheas of 3 rabbits. Unsurprisingly, 2 of the rabbits then died of suffocation. In another experiment, multiple injections of the diseased tissue into rabbits did not produce the anticipated reaction. Due to a series of mixed and disappointing experimental observations, some investigators concluded, quote, Diphtheria micrococcus represents an active state of the micrococci that are always present in healthy and inflamed throats. Under certain as yet unknown circumstances, the common micrococcus can acquire growth energy and the power to produce epidemics, transitioning from its, quote, dormant state to the, quote, active state. The first part of that is a nod to terrain theory and the concept that microbes simply react to underlying conditions. However, they continue to assert the germ theory and cite, quote, unknown circumstances that cause microbes to turn rogue and start attacking us. More on that later. Loeffler details other poorly designed rabbit experiments, and at this point of the essay concedes, has any researcher so far succeeded in meeting the postulates set out at the beginning of our discussion? The answer must be no. He also comments that the diseases in the animals did not resemble diphtheria, and, quote, some succeeded in achieving completely identical processes in their test animals using non-diphtheria material. In the next part of the essay, Loeffler lists 27 cases of human diphtheria, essentially all children and most ending in death. Once again, the association of bacteria and inflamed throats and mucosal surfaces was noted. From some of these cases, he reported successful isolation and culture of pure chain-forming micrococci. In case you were wondering, he noted that this bacterium could also be grown on cooked potatoes.
Potatoes! Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
Loeffler then carried out what he called transmission experiments by injecting his cocci culture directly into mice. Often this resulted in the death of the victim, but clearly it did not replicate any process in nature. Similar experiments were repeated with guinea pigs, but as they did not react, that animal model was abandoned. Rabbits were tested by injection but only developed reddened areas or abscesses. Chickens, pigeons, canaries, a dog, and finally some monkeys also proved disappointing in regard to the bacterium thought to be causing diphtheria. Not dissuaded by the failures of these experiments, Loeffler then looked to other sources of the bacterial species, including a rod-shaped form. Subsequent experiments included cutting into the tracheas of rabbits, traumatizing the windpipe further by moving a needle up and down while injecting the bacterial culture, and then suturing it all back together. Not surprisingly, this resulted in marked inflammation, breathing difficulties, and sometimes death. Dozens more experiments were performed on a variety of animals, and the themes throughout the trail of animal destruction are clear. First, the absence of valid controls. A control experiment would have involved inflicting the same trauma on the animals and injecting the same volume of broth, minus the bacterial cells. This was not done. And remember, it had been noted that similar reactions could be observed when non-diphtherial material was used. Second was the completely unnatural exposure routes that were used. It is claimed that the bacteria spread readily through the air via coughs and sneezes to attack the throats of nearby people. However, in the animal models, the techniques involved injections and trauma. Third was the selection bias, where favoured animals were chosen based on the desired reactions that could be induced. At this point of the essay, Loeffler offers the following regarding C. diphtheriae. Should we regard them as the specific causative agents of the disease, or, like the other microorganisms found in diphtheria products, as accidental companions to diphtheria? To decide this question, there remains only one approach: to culture the secretions from the oral cavities of as many individuals as possible, especially children of those age groups who are particularly predisposed to diphtheria, and to examine the colonies that have developed. In other words, there is, quote, only one approach when the hypothesis has failed, and that is to keep doing the same thing with a variation in the interpretation. So Loeffler coins the statement that the rods must first be detected in a number of cases before one can say with certainty that they can truly be considered the cause of this infectious disease. We are back to square one here, because simply detecting the presence of the bacteria does not establish causation of disease. Furthermore, he continues to use the term infectious without experimental evidence, as they relied on unnatural exposure routes to induce reactions. All he cites is epidemiological observations, such as an incident in 1876 involving the death of 20 suckling calves, quote, housed in the same stable, and another in 1881 where, quote, a loft of about 20 pigeons perished within a few weeks. Apparently there can be no other reason why a group of animals get sick while under shared environmental conditions. Loeffler's imagination also runs wild when he asserts that his observations in some of the animals, quote, resembled the transmission of diphtheria in humans through kissing. Throughout the lengthy paper, the methodologies are insufficient to show that C. diphtheriae could instigate disease in animals, let alone cause a transmissible illness in humans. All that could be concluded was that the bacterium was found in both healthy and sick organisms, and in the case of the latter, their numbers may proliferate or the cells may change shape. Such observations are entirely consistent with terrain theory and pleomorphism in response to underlying tissue changes. Something else causes the tissue compromise, and the bacteria simply perform their role in response, often as the cleanup crew. Loeffler does admit in his conclusion that, quote, there are still links missing in the chain of evidence that the 3 diphtherias under consideration are of a bacillary nature. However, he continues, I nevertheless consider public health not only justified, but even obligated to take these possibilities into account. The responses he advises are in the form of strict isolation of sick individuals, de-infection of their rooms, disinfectant treatment to affected body cavities, and removal of disease products. So there you have the foundational 1884 paper that completely failed to show that Corynebacterium were disease-causing microbes. And yet we live in a world where it is cited by textbooks and many authors as if it is a scientific fact. Like Koch and Pasteur's original work, it appears very unlikely that most people in the field have actually read these papers. Now, subsequent to Loeffler's time, it has been claimed that these bacteria are usually harmless unless they are infected by a bacteriophage carrying a gene which gives rise to a toxin. This toxin causes the disease. Don't take your eye off the ball here. This does not get round the problem of demonstrating that any form of Corynebacterium can instigate disease. A toxin may well be formed by the microbe as it acts on dead and dying tissue, but that remains downstream from the original cause. And for those of you interested in a deeper dive on the topic of bacteriophages, please look at my husband Mark's essay, Virus, Bacteriophage and Single Virus Genomics. There are several other aspects of diphtheria that could be addressed, but one of the most common questions we see is, what about the vaccines? After all, the CDC recommends these vaccines for everyone. Someone who has extensive experience in refuting misleading publications from vaccine promoters is Jordan Henderson. He has specifically dealt with diphtheria vaccine mythology in this example. In 2021, the CDC's Pink Book stated that, with regard to diphtheria, there were 100,000 to 200,000 cases and 13,000 to 15,000 deaths reported annually before vaccines. Cases gradually declined after vaccines were introduced in the 1940s, and cases rapidly declined after the universal vaccination program in the late 1940s. Now, this is a very deceptive way to frame what happened. So Jordan places this in the full historical context to make it clear that the vast improvements in outcomes took place well before vaccines arrived. We also have Roman Bastianak's comprehensive charts, including this one, that shows diphtheria mortality rates in the United States from 1900 to 1967. We can see that the introduction of a diphtheria vaccine in 1920 was not associated with any improvement in the background downwards trend line. And with regard to the effect of antibiotics, they were not widely available until the 1940s. So we can see on this chart that by the time antibiotics came into use, death rates from alleged bacterial diseases such as diphtheria and whooping cough had almost gone down to zero. What about the experience in my home country of Aotearoa or New Zealand? Jordan Henderson's chart clearly shows that by the time a national diphtheria vaccination program started in 1941, case mortality had almost gone down to zero. And for the critics arguing it's not just about mortality, but about case numbers as well, Jordan Henderson's earlier chart dealt with that. Additionally, Greg Beattie from Vaccination Dilemma produced this chart showing the Australian figures. Once again, clearly the trend in notified case numbers was downwards and could not be explained by the later arrival of widespread vaccines. To expand on this theme for those wanting an overview of the measly contribution that the entire medico-pharmaceutical system has made to humanity's health, please watch my video, The Healthcare System Hoax. Coming back to our main topic of diphtheria, it is obvious that this type of illness has become insignificant in developed countries. This has been the result of improved general living conditions, and certainly not because of fraudulent stories involving vaccines and antibiotics. Germ theory was never valid, and you do not become unwell through ubiquitous bacteria that suddenly attack you. While many historic childhood conditions such as diphtheria have disappeared, sadly, they have been replaced by a raft of new ones, including obesity, asthma, inflammatory conditions, and autism. The response from many public health institutions has been to shrug their shoulders and pressure parents into lining their children up for even more vaccines. It is clearly leading to worse health outcomes, while the best living practices are being ignored. However, the good news is that more people are waking up to the vaccine fraud and are protecting their loved ones from such assaults. Help us spread the word by sharing this video with all those that would benefit from the information. And please check out the resources at drsambailey.com, including the book Terrain Therapy, for ways to achieve your best health. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com.